Conformity in juries. I'm going to focus on the processes of one particular group, juries. In the movie 12 Angry Men, it is about a jury at the beginning who seems completely ready to convict a young Hispanic man of murder, with one problem. One man thinks he's innocent. The movie is about how one man ultimately converts those other 12 men to his position, leading to an acquittal. But how realistic is this? How often does this really happen in real life? There's actually been a lot of research done on this very question, and as it turns out, 12 Angry Men is not very realistic at all. Studies show that what typically happens in a staggering percentage of cases is that whatever side the majority of jurors begin on is the side that the verdict eventually falls on. Remember Ash's studies of conformity. It is much more likely that one juror who disagrees will conform to everyone else's position than the other way around. This effect is so strong that one researcher was prompted to say the deliberation process might as well be likened to what the developer does for an exposed film. It brings out the picture, but the outcome is predetermined. So does the group deliberation influence the process at all? Maybe we should just let the jurors decide individually. An attorney in Colorado once requested that a jury of one person be used to try his client because he feared the mob mentality of 12 people. What do you think? Are groups more likely than individuals to convict? Well, actually, there is one way that the group deliberation does tend to sway juries. It is called the leniency bias. The leniency bias is that people in groups are less likely to vote guilty than if jurors were left completely to themselves. In this sense, 12 Angry Men is more realistic. What about jury size? Is 6 as good as 12? In 1970, the Supreme Court ruled on whether or not 6-person juries were acceptable. They used social psychological research to justify their decision. In particular, Ash's study that we talked about earlier. What did they decide? They decided that 6 and 12-person juries were equivalent because the chance of minority opinions influence in the group was equal. They reasoned that a 5-to-1 majority was the same as a 10-to-2 majority because the proportions were the same. This is wrong. This is such a gross misinterpretation that social psychologist Michael Sachs said it would not win a passing grade in high school. Remember, regardless of group size, nothing helps a lone dissenter like having an ally. In fact, 6-person juries tend to spend less time deliberating and recall less of the actual evidence than 12-person juries. Obedience. Something often associated with compliance, which is of great interest to psychologists, is obedience. Obedience is when people follow direct commands, usually from someone in authority. Alan Funt was the creator and producer of an old TV program called Candid Camera, a show in which real-life people were caught in strange situations on a hidden camera. When Funt was asked what he learned about people as a result of being the producer of this show, he replied, "The worst thing, and I see it over and over, is how easily people can be led by any kind of authority figure, or even the most minimal signs of authority. Human beings seem ready to obey anyone who has even the resemblance of authority. For instance, consider the example of the time when a national flood warning was issued in a Midwestern area. In the middle of the crisis, a young man stepped in and announced that he was from a state agency which had jurisdiction over the area for flood crisis, and proceeded to take control of the operation. For several days, his orders were followed to the letter by the fire department, police, and even the National Guard. He even had several areas evacuated, and then finally someone thought to actually check his story and found out that he was just some guy off the street with a history of mental problems. Consider even a more serious case. Back in the 1970s, there was a cult founded by a guy named Jim Jones. Now, Jim took a bunch of Americans down to South America and founded a little town of about 700 or so of his followers. Some governmental officials went down to check on the followers, and to make a long story short, they got into a fight, and one of the governmental officials was shot and killed. After that, Jim Jones gave a long speech and then ordered all of his followers to kill themselves by drinking some poisoned Kool-Aid. And all of them obeyed, and all of them died. Well, these are anecdotal stories, but what about the research evidence? What does the research evidence say about our tendency to obey authority? Stanley Milgram became interested in the area of obedience, at least in part because of the horrible things the Nazis did following Hitler's orders in World War II. He wondered to what extent the Germans were being normal, or so to speak, in their unabashed following of authority, no matter how atrocious the thing they were ordered to do was. He thought that the Germans were probably particularly prone to obeying authority, which might help explain what happened in World War II. In other words, he thought there was something different about citizens of Germany that made them obey. He planned on running some studies over here in the US, and then running some studies in Germany and comparing the results. And as we'll see, he never made it to Germany. Imagine yourself in the following experiment. You come to the experiment, which you were told had to do with the effects of punishment on learning. When you arrive, you are introduced to your fellow subject, a friendly man of about 50 years of age. Then you draw from a hat to see which one of you is going to be the teacher and which one of you is going to be the learner. You are relieved to find out that you're going to be the teacher. Milgram then explains the procedure. The learner is to be strapped to an electrified chair through which shocks can be administered. You hear the learner express concern about receiving electric shocks because he has a pacemaker. You're also a little concerned. The experimenter, however, says that everything's fine. The shocks will be painful but not damaging. You are led into an adjoining room where you cannot see the learner. You, the teacher, were to shock the learner every time he makes a mistake. The shock would increase in intensity with each mistake, like this. Also, underneath the voltage number labels, there were verbal markers like this. Now imagine that the learner starts missing quite a few times. You proceed up the shock levels through slight shock, very strong shock, and so forth. Occasionally, you look questioningly at the experimenter, but he nods as if everything is all right, so you continue. After a while, however, something terrible happens. When you shock the learner, you hear this "ah" from the other room. You realize that the learner is screaming in pain. After screaming a few times as you move further up the scale, the learner begins to scream something like, "My pacemaker's acting up. Let me out of here." You look up at the experimenter and ask him, "He's in pain, what should we do?" The experimenter replies, "The experiment must go on." Think about what you would do at this point. You know you're administering painful shocks. The learner is screaming in pain, eventually screaming that he wants out, that he is in danger of his pacemaker failing and literally pounding on the door to get out. After a while, there is no sound at all when you administer the shocks. The man is completely silent, but the experimenter says, "Go on." Well, what did these people do? How many people out of 40 do you think went past the 300 mark? How about past the 350 mark? How many people do you think went all the way to the very end of the scale where it said XXX? Amazingly, 26 people went all the way to the end. That's 65%. 65% of the participants continued to shock the Confederate to the end of the study, even when it appeared the Confederate's life might be in danger. Why would people do this? How could people do something that was so obviously endangering another's welfare? Were these people all sick? Was there something wrong with the people in the study? No, people appeared to be psychologically healthy. They certainly weren't all sick people. They were men from the local community who had a wide variety of backgrounds. Almost all of them, even the ones who went through all the shock levels, protested a great deal at many points. They would tell the researcher, "We can't do this, he's hurting," but nonetheless would continue. A couple of people laughed at the learner, but they later said they did it out of stress. So why? One of the main factors is the passing of responsibility. The subjects feel that the experimenter is responsible for any harm to the learner. When the Nazi war criminals were tried in Nuremberg trials after World War II, they all gave the exact same response: I was just following orders. In other words, the responsibility is not mine, but that of the authority figure who gave me the orders.